Join me as I delve into a young man's story of courage, sacrifice, and unimaginable darkness. In 1968, Jose Luis Rivera, an 18-year-old boy, stood outside a recruiter's office in Mayagüez, Puerto Rico. He stared at the poster reading America's Navy, Let the Journey Begin. He imagined his tall and slim frame, dressed in the service white uniform. He's the oldest son from a loving and ambitious family with a history of military service. His grandfather and father served in the famous Puerto Rican 65th Infantry. His dad earned a Bronze Star in World War II. Jose wanted to follow in their footsteps. Back then, young men, including men from the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, were drafted for the Vietnam War. Many people thought the draft was unjust, especially Puerto Ricans. Since they have no political representation in Congress, they felt it immoral to be drafted into a war they had no say in. His friends marched in the anti-draft demonstrations, and he knew the risks of serving in wartime. But despite the war's unpopularity, he eagerly enlisted. Little did he know the unfortunate consequences he would endure would be unrelated to the war. He went to Chicago for basic training. He was athletic and smart, scoring an 85 on his ASVAB, only scoring poorly in word knowledge and paragraph comprehension because English was his second language. His science, math, and electronic scores were all above average. Basic training is tough for everyone, but was extra challenging for Jose. Much of the instruction from his superiors was lost in translation. He tried his best to listen, but it was difficult to understand and follow orders he was given. Unfortunately, this created a barrier between him and the other young sailors, as they had just assumed he was stupid. Although basic training and his A school, where he received technical training, were challenging, he got through both. He studied tirelessly, determined to prove he was a worthy sailor. He trained as an avionics technician, working on aircraft, electronic systems, and graduated with honors. His first duty station was Sigonella Naval Air Station in Sicily, but he was allowed to return home on leave before shipping out. He looked forward to seeing his family and his longtime girlfriend Maya. Jose and Maya had planned on marrying each other since they first met in elementary school. As they grew up together, their love for each other grew as well. On the day he returned home, he took his beautiful girlfriend to their favorite beach and proposed to her during sunset. She joyously accepted. They were married with their family's blessings at Playa El Combate. The young couple was excited beyond words to start their lives together in Italy. Jose shipped out shortly after the ceremony, and Maya soon followed. Jose did well at his first duty station. The Navy base was a city unto itself, with barracks, mess halls, a library, post office, all nestled together within the confines of the gates. Jose loved it all. The hive of activity, personnel rushing everywhere, planes taking off and landing, and the chatter of radios filling the air. Off base, because the Italian and Spanish languages are so similar, Jose and Maya had no problem communicating. They adapted well and quickly immersed themselves into Sicilian society. At first he was underestimated, but he worked hard to earn the respect of his fellow sailors and his superiors. In late 1969, he and Maya welcomed a daughter named Sarah. Jose was an E4 Petty Officer 3rd Class, which paid him $250 a month. The young family barely scraped by. They rented a studio apartment from an Italian family off base. Their little apartment sat behind the Italian family's main house. Living off base earned him a little extra money due to receiving a housing allowance. On base in Jose's workshop, he was simply known as Joe. Joe's shop supervisor, Chief Bill Carter, instantly liked his work ethic. Chief Carter liked that Joe was in the Navy voluntarily, like himself. And the chief reminded Joe of his revered male relatives back home. Chief Carter grew up dirt poor in the woods of Arkansas. The only food his family could afford was what they trapped or hunted, fish, possums, raccoons, and such. In his teens, he grew so tired of eating wild game, the smell of it disgusted him. Even though he still had to hunt and clean the game for his family, he stopped eating it. He ate bologna sandwiches for 2 years straight, which caused him to have horrible acne all over his body. He told Joe that when he went into basic training, he had so much acne on his skull that when they buzzed his hair, blood and pus ran down his face, and it was all over the barber's clippers. After a few weeks of healthy Navy food, his acne cleared up. The Navy was his lifeline, giving him a chance at a life Arkansas could not have. His favorite saying about his home was, "Arkansas is the land of opportunity. Take the first one to get away." After 20 years, Carter lived and breathed the Navy. He took great pride in his appearance. Every detail was perfect. The creases in his pants were sharp, and the shine on his shoes mirror-like. Up top, a perfectly sculptured white flat top. His appearance reflected his dedication to duty and high standards for himself and his fellow sailors. Joe quickly became his star troop, and the chief often bragged to others about him. He'd say, "This war would be over if I had 10 more like Joe." Unlike the other recruits in his shop, he knew if he put Joe on a job, it would get done without questions or complaints. The chief had little faith in the drafty generation. He thought they were all just lazy complainers. During the war, if you were drafted and did not want to go to the Army or Marines, you could enlist in another branch before you reached the induction center. So although many recruits had voluntarily enlisted, it was only to avoid mandatory service in another branch. To many pre-draft service members like Chief Carter, these recruits were second-rate. Another issue the chief had with the draft era recruits was drug use. In the 60s, drugs were more mainstream and accessible than ever before. Up to 51% of service members used marijuana during the Vietnam War. The country was changing, and so was the Navy. The stress of war, the draft, corrupt politics, the civil rights movement, and a considerable lack of support for the military from home had people looking for ways to cope. Marijuana and other drugs were the answer. The Navy had a zero-tolerance policy, and lifers like Chief Carter hated drugs and anyone who used them. The chief loved the rich naval traditions and history and didn't care for anyone who thought differently. He was sure these stoned and lazy recruits would ruin his beloved Navy. He shared his thoughts on the younger recruits and their drug use with Joe, who always agreed, since he also had no use for them. Joe had always known he would be a Navy lifer like the chief, whom he greatly respected. He and Maya and Sarah regularly visited the chief's house for dinner. Even though they grew close, he always referred to his superior by title. When he saw them at the Navy Exchange or Commissary, he'd always refer to them respectfully as Chief Carter and to his wife as Miss Carter. After a year in, Chief Carter recommended Joe for the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, a prestigious award. As he presented it to him, he spoke of Joe's hard work and dedication to duty and how much his shipmates respected him. He said Joe had the drive, dedication, and intelligence to succeed in the Navy. Joe's efforts were paying off, and he was on his way to a promising career in the military. He and Maya were doing well, and they looked forward to what the future held for their family. Joe rented his studio apartment from Leonardo and Sofia Russo. The Russo family had 3 children. Their youngest son, Renzo, was Joe's age. Joe and Renzo hung out from time to time and became friends. Renzo was a popular and social guy around town, and introduced Joe and Maya to other people their age. Miss Russo, Renzo's mom, was always happy to babysit little Sarah while Renzo showed the couple around. Everything was going well for the young family, and they could not have been happier. Renzo was a bit of a wild child, always looking for a good time. Joe liked him a lot, and everyone did, but when he learned he made extra money by selling drugs, he strived to avoid his neighbor. A couple of times he saw Americans coming to Renzo's door to score drugs. Renzo asked Joe if he wanted to help him sell to the Americano sailors, who were his best customers, and Joe made it very clear that he was not interested. Renzo never pressured Joe again, but liked to remind him that he was missing out on easy money. Joe knew how his superiors felt about drugs. He was careful to avoid being seen by other sailors buying drugs from Renzo, and several times sailors who knew where Joe lived asked him if he could help them score. The perception of involvement really bothered him. He and Maya decided to look for another place to rent. In late January of 1970, Maya and Sarah went home to Puerto Rico so that baby Sarah could meet and spend time with her grandparents. While Maya was gone, Joe's job was to find another place to live. Maya was due back in 2 weeks. He did find a home and got everything set to move when she returned. Little did he know, however, that their lives were about to take a drastic and unexpected turn. One day, Renzo, a charismatic and persuasive guy, invited Joe to the Feast of St. Agatha. Joe declined knowing drugs would be there, but Renzo persisted, saying it would be a great time. Renzo explained the 3-day festival honors a Catania teenage virgin who died a martyr. She was a beautiful young girl who was kidnapped and tortured for rejecting the advances of a distinguished Roman. To honor her, the city holds a big parade with fireworks. Joe was reluctant to attend the celebration with Renzo, but eventually gave in. On the day of the festival, Renzo showed up at Joe's apartment with 2 bottles of local wine. The 2 men drank the wine and felt buzzed before heading to Catania. When they arrived, the festival was in full swing. They were engulfed in a sea of people celebrating the feast and joined in with the crowd to wait for the fireworks show in the cathedral square. The streets were lined with vendors selling various food, drinks, and souvenirs, Renzo introduced Joe to many of his friends, who were all having a good time. They were passing around a joint. Joe declined their offers and stuck to alcohol. The atmosphere was electric. The night was a blur of music, dancing, and laughter. Joe found himself enjoying the festivities despite his reservations. He enjoyed the beautiful Sicilian night and wished Maya could see it with him. Although having a great time, Joe was nervous about being seen with Renzo. He saw Americans and other tourists mixed in with the primarily Sicilian crowd. After the parade, he decided to sober up so at least one of them could drive home. But Renzo kept drinking and smoking. While they stumbled through the crowds, waiting for the fireworks, Joe's worst nightmare came true. A couple of American sailors approached Renzo and asked him if they could score some weed or hash. Joe quickly walked away while Renzo made the deal. Joe could tell that one of the sailors recognized him. Renzo made the sale quickly, and the customer stumbled off into the dark night. Joe scolded Renzo and reminded him that if those sailors ever said anything about him being involved with drugs, his career in the Navy would be over. Renzo apologized profusely for upsetting his friend. Joe's rubberman continued until Renzo promised never to put Joe in that situation again. They head for a bar, and Renzo promises to pay for all Joe's drinks to make amends. They continued on with their great night and watched the end of the fireworks. Around 3 a.m., Joe helped Renzo stumble back to their car. Walking back through an alley, they noticed a crowd where police were making arrests. It looked like there was a fight. Joe recognized the sailors from earlier in the night being detained. As he and Renzo headed toward the group, the sailor pointed at them and told the policeman something. The policeman turned to look at them. The policeman yelled at the two of them to stop and walk toward them. He got to them and asked them if they were selling drugs. Joe, the only one coherent enough to speak, denied the accusation. He said he was an American in the military. Renzo slumped down on the sidewalk and leaned back against the wall. He smiled and mumbled something incoherent. The police officer demanded to see Joe's ID, and he handed over his military ID. The officer examined it and then handed it back, satisfied. He searched and found nothing on Joe, but found hash and a bag full of rolled marijuana joints on Renzo. Joe and Renzo got thrown in with the other men to be arrested and driven to jail. Joe was scared, but he knew he had done nothing wrong and thought he could resolve the misunderstanding. Joe and Renzo were put into a drunk tank. The cell was cramped and damp, with a musty odor that lingered in the air. Renzo immediately passed out. Joe pleaded with the sailors to tell the police he had nothing to do with selling them drugs. One of the intoxicated sailors responded by singing drunkenly, "Like birds of a feather, all you spicks stick together." The others were too drunk and stoned to pay attention to Joe. He got so mad at the drunken group that he threatened to kill them if they did not tell the police the truth. Joe's outbursts fell on deaf ears. Everyone fell asleep except for Joe. His mind was too panicked to sleep. He stared at the dim overhead lights, flickering sporadically, casting eerie shadows across the chipped and stained walls. The drunk tanks grew silent as Joe worried about how to get out of the mess. The next day, Joe woke up with a sense of regret. He knew he had let his guard down and made a huge mistake. He was angry with himself for getting involved with Renzo. Again, the other sailors ignored Joe's pleading. The police officer took the men away one at a time to question them. During his questioning, Joe explained that he had nothing to do with drugs. The police officer said, "The other American statements say you and your friend, Lorenzo, sold the drugs to them." Joe, in disbelief, shed tears as he pleaded his case. The officer informed him that the penalty for selling drugs was up to a year in jail. We do not take Americans selling drugs in this country lightly. The cop said if he was just an innocent neighbor, they would let him go, but he must tell them everything he knew about Lorenzo's dealings. He said they didn't want to arrest American military members. They only wanted the drug dealers off the streets. Joe decided he could no longer risk his career in the Navy or his family's future by associating with Renzo. He complied. He shakily wrote out a complete statement implicating Renzo. After signing the statement, he felt devastated for exposing Renzo's business, but he told himself he had no choice. While Joe was still away, Renzo woke up. He was confused about why they were in jail. He tried to get answers from the sailors, but they ignored him. The police told him that all of his American friends had already made statements against him. They said you were the capo, or drug lord. Jose already told us everything about your dealing business out of your mom's house, and we found drugs on you. You will be spending a long time in jail. Renzo tried to deny everything, but it was no use. The officers emphasized the details of Joe's statement to turn the two against each other. Renzo was street smart and ignored the tactic. He sat stoically, but his mind grew furious with Joe. He knew the officers had already established their case against him. After his interrogation, Renzo was returned to a cell adjacent to Joe. "Why did you tell the police that I'm a drug dealer?" he angrily asked Joe. "I had to. I can't go to jail for your stupid drugs." Renzo shouted. "You should have kept your fucking mouth shut, you idiot, and we'd both be going home by now. Now we are fucking stuck in here. You don't know how things work in Sicily." He claimed that if Joe retracted his statement, he would get them out of jail in a week or two. "I can't stay here for weeks. I have to work and support a family," Joe said. Renzo cussed Joe out furiously. By the end of the day, the white sailors were fined and released. Only Joe and Renzo remained in custody. "I need to speak to somebody from the U.S. Navy base," Joe screamed at a passing guard. The guard said, "Your commanding officer was already here. He left earlier with the other Americanos." Joe was stunned. He slumped onto the bench, and his mind went red with rage and worry. He and Renzo stopped talking to each other. After a few hours, a guard took them to another part of the building for further processing. They were strip-searched and given inmate clothes. Joe was put into a cell by himself. He sat on a creaky metal bunk bed, covered in a thin, torn, stained mattress, and only had a scratchy wool blanket for warmth. He was given dinner and told he would see the judge in the morning. The guard asked if he wanted to make a phone call. Joe asked if he could call his wife long distance. The guard laughed at him and said no. He had nobody else to call. Depression, fear, and hopelessness sank in. He imagined the worst, a year in jail. He spent the entire night thinking about Maya, Sarah, and his family back home. He thought about what Chief Carter would think when he found out he was in jail, being accused of selling drugs. He couldn't believe that after all he went through, and how hard he had tried to succeed, he was being accused of being a drug dealer. He was angry with himself for going with Renzo in the first place. He cursed himself for being so stupid and cried himself to sleep. In the morning, he was given breakfast and told the judge would see him soon. In the 70s, in Italy, habeas corpus, unlawful imprisonment, meant almost nothing. Police in Italy could detain a person for days or weeks on the pretext that they were guilty and still gathering evidence against a suspect. The belief was that if a suspect was released, it permitted them the opportunity to destroy evidence, so they could just hold you on suspicion of a crime. Joe's court time arrived, and he felt sick to his stomach as he was led into a courtroom where a judge sat at a raised wooden desk. Several other men were sitting in rows of benches. Renzo was sitting on a bench talking to a man in a suit who looked like a lawyer. Another man in a suit sat next to him and introduced himself. He explained he was a legal advocate the Navy retained to represent American servicemen in these situations. He pointed out Renzo and told Joe his friend also had a legal advocate from the Italian government. Joe looked over at Renzo, who stared straight ahead, and avoided eye contact with him. Joe turned back to the man and tried to focus on his own situation and listened carefully to his advocate's advice. The advocate said he had read the other sailors' statements against him and told Joe they would plead guilty and hope for leniency. He said pleading guilty would get his sentence reduced by up to a third. Joe respectfully replied, "I am not guilty. I need to get out of here. I don't sell drugs. Renzo is the drug dealer, and I am only his neighbor. He just invited me to go to the festival with him." Joe's eyes began to water. The advocate looked uneasy. He informed Joe that a single-judge court would handle his case, but Joe shouldn't worry because he could appeal any decisions made by this judge. "Just let me do the talking," the advocate said. Joe panicked inside. His stomach dropped as if he had been falling. He felt off balance and dizzy. He didn't know what to do, but he was sure he did not want to plead guilty. His advocate said, "You have a chance if Lorenzo takes full responsibility." Sadly for Joe, Renzo still saw Joe's statement as the only reason they were still in jail, and since Joe would not retract it, Renzo abandoned any idea of helping him. "Lorenzo Russo," called the judge, and Renzo and his advocate stood up. The judge stated he had reviewed the evidence and asked for a plea. Renzo pled guilty. Joe's heart sank when he heard the judge sentence him to 1 year in jail. Renzo stayed stone-faced, eyes locked on the back wall as he was led out of the room. Joe's advocate leaned over to him and whispered, "He will get out in 8 or 9 months, maybe less." Next, the judge called Jose Luis Rivera. A pressure seized Joe's heart as they stood and approached the desk. Joe's advocate argued his case, emphasizing that there was no evidence against Joe and that he was only in the wrong place at the wrong time. He said his client had been arrested by mistake. He was only the neighbor of Lorenzo Russo and only accompanied him to last night's festival. He knew nothing of the drugs. He informed the court that Joe was an honorable man, a sailor in the U.S. Navy. The judge said, "This honorable man claims that his companion bears all of the guilt and responsibility for their business endeavors." The judge smiled as he asked for Joe's plea. The advocate conferred with Joe. Joe spoke for himself and said, "Your Honor, I am not guilty. Please understand, I am not a drug dealer. I only accompanied Renzo to the festival. He is my neighbor. I have a family and I do not sell or do drugs. I did not know he was going to sell the drugs." The judge said, "I have read the case, including the statements from the sailors and your own statement implicating Mr. Russo, and discussed your case with Mr. Russo's advocate. Mr. Russo did not make any statements relieving you of responsibility. Why wouldn't your friend tell us you were only an innocent guest? Additionally, your statement clearly showed you were aware Mr. Russo sold drugs before attending the festival. At least Mr. Russo had the courage to accept responsibility for his legal deviances. If for nothing else you were guilty by association, I'll ask again, do you wish to plead not guilty? Joe spoke from his heart, once again, telling the judge about his family, his dedication to the Navy, and his innocence. He pleaded for the judge to believe him and release him from jail. The judge deliberated for a minute and then delivered his verdict. He looked down at Joe over the papers he was holding and said, I'm going to allow you some time to think about breaking the laws of this country. Your sentence is 16 months. He then called the next case's name to imply that Joe's allotted time was up. His advocate said follow me and led him out of the room. Don't worry, he told Joe. I will start work on the appeal and be in touch. Feeling weak, defeated, and with a lump in his throat, Joe was led away from the advocate by a police officer down a dimly lit hallway lined with cracked and faded concrete. He couldn't believe he had been sentenced to over a year in jail for something he hadn't done. He followed the officer, walking slowly and senseless, as if his soul had left his body. He knew he should have been angry and scared, but his mind was shocked and numb, except for an image of his wife and daughter floating before him. On the verge of physical collapse, he was processed into the Casa Circondariale. There are two types of jails in Italy: Casa Circondariale, for people awaiting trial with short sentences or less than a few years, and Casa Giudicario, where much longer sentences are served. As he moved into the permanent facility, he ignored the other inmates and kept to himself. He was led to a large room with several bunk beds stacked 3 high. The rusted bars on the windows were covered in grime and filth, blocking out what little light could filter through. The room was already overcrowded, and there were no empty beds. His bed was a thin mat and blanket on the floor. Joe had no idea he had already been labeled un informatore, an informant. Renzo told people he knew in jail that Joe was a spia del caso, meaning a fucking snitch, and news about Joe traveled fast. The cell leader, Ricardo, who had already heard about the American rat, introduced himself. He was a local gang member in his late 20s. He explained he controlled everything the men in the cell did, including who got a bed. Ricardo didn't pull any punches. He immediately disliked Joe and told him so everyone could hear. He made it clear to all that Joe was at the bottom of the pecking order. He also nicknamed him Medigon, a play on words. It's a contraction of the Italian word mierda, meaning shit, and cane, meaning dog. But in Italian, shit of dog, Medigon, sounds very close to the word Americano. Ricardo told the rest of the men that Medigon thought he was better than Italianos because he was in the American military. Hearing that Joe was a rat gave him all the justification he needed to start making Joe's life hell. The lump in Joe's throat got larger as he listened to Ricardo's words. He had heard about prison hierarchies, but never thought he would be wrapped up in them. He knew that he needed to be careful and could not afford to make any wrong moves. Joe spent his first night in prison lying on his mat staring at the ceiling. He could hear the sounds of the other inmates snoring and muttering in their sleep. He felt alone, isolated, and afraid. He thought about his wife and daughter and wondered how they would cope without him. He knew that he needed to stay strong for them and that he could not let himself give up. Over the next few days, Joe kept a low profile. He stayed out of the way of the other inmates, avoiding any confrontations. He spent most of his time trying to come to terms with the situation. Despite his efforts to keep to himself, Joe could not escape the constant harassment from Ricardo and his gang. They taunted him, stole his food, and made it clear that he was not welcome. Joe tried to ignore them, but he knew things would only worsen if he did not stand up for himself. The other men knew that when Ricardo blacklisted an inmate, he was fair game for everyone. This meant there was no chance of anyone befriending Joe. He had no protection, not even from the guards. His possessions were up for grabs. The inmates insulted and treated him savagely. On his third morning, sitting alone eating in the yard, a large inmate in his 30s, who was twice his size, approached him. He had a few friends with him. He demanded that Joe give him his food, and when Joe refused, the large man punched him in the face. Joe attempted to fight back, but he was quickly overpowered. The man easily threw Joe to the ground and pummeled him into it. The other inmates watched, cheering the big man on and calling Joe a fucking rat. Joe was beaten, nearly unconscious. He lay bruised and battered as the gang walked away. Joe looked out through his swollen eyes and saw Ricardo standing nearby with a big smile, seemingly pleased with the day's entertainment. Joe was eventually helped back to his mat by the guards. He knew he would need to respond when he recovered, and wondered if he should challenge Ricardo. He could not continue being bullied. He was sure Ricardo had ordered the attack, and he was also sure he was on his own in this jail. He knew his wife would be returning to Sicily soon, and he hoped with some help she could get him out of this fucked up situation. Until then, he needed to find Renzo and talk to him so he could get rid of the snitch reputation. Joe reluctantly explored the jail, full of unfriendly faces, looking for Renzo. When Maya and Sarah returned to Sicily, the house was empty. She saw their belongings were packed up, but no sign of Joe. After a few hours, she saw Miss Russo, who told her the terrible news. Miss Russo said the two boys had been arrested for selling drugs at the festival in Catania. That's impossible, Maya said. Joe would never sell drugs. Miss Russo told her that several American sailors had already testified against him, and he had been sentenced to 16 months. Even though Maya felt the older woman was mistaken, she said, I must go see him and get him out. Maya excused herself to call the jail and found out what Miss Russo had said was true. She learned she had to wait a week for visitation permission to be granted. Joe could receive 3 monthly visits from a relative, each lasting 1 hour. Visitors could bring clothes, food, and books. She stayed in bed and cried while she waited for permission to see Joe. Meanwhile, Joe had no luck mending his relationship with Renzo. Renzo shouted at him, I had to plead guilty because they used your statement as evidence against me. I told you to take back your statement. Now we are both stuck here, so get the fuck away from me and go fuck yourself. Renzo turned and walked back toward his friends. The other inmates who heard the conversation stared maliciously at Joe as he walked away. The friendship they once had was over. Joe felt betrayed by Renzo's decision, but knew he could not change it. He now knew he was stuck in jail unless he could get help from the outside. He spent most of his time alone, sitting on his mat, thinking about his family. The other men continued to be hostile to him, with insults, intimidation, and fights. As Maya waited for permission, she felt lost and hopeless. She couldn't imagine how Joe felt, alone and without any support in a foreign prison. She spent most of her days in bed crying and worrying about the future. Finally, after a week of waiting, Maya received permission to visit Joe. She went to the prison early in the morning, carrying a bag of clothes and food for him. She was nervous and scared, not knowing what to expect. Joe was excited when he finally got word from a guard that he would have a visitor in the afternoon. He wondered if it was his advocate or Maya, but he hoped for the latter. He had missed his family so much that his heart had grown tight and heavy. When he saw Maya waiting for him in the visiting room, he felt like his heart would burst from the anticipation of holding her in his arms. When she saw Joe, her heart broke. He looked thin, tired, and beaten. He had bruises on his face and red eyes from crying. He composed himself as he walked over to her table. He was saddened to learn they could not embrace. They sat across from each other at the table and held hands to give each other comfort. They looked into each other's eyes for several moments without speaking. He also saw her worried, reddened eyes had been crying. She broke the silence and asked, Are you okay? He said with a smile, Yes, it's rough in here, but I'm fine. Joe told her everything that had happened to him since he was arrested. He told her about Renzo and Ricardo, the attack in the cell, and his reputation as a snitch. Maya listened carefully, feeling angry and helpless. She knew they needed to find a way to get Joe out of prison and clear his name, but she didn't know how. He gave her the name of the advocate and told her to see him and check on the appeal. She told Joe that she could only visit him 3 times a month, so they decided she would visit every 9 days. She assured him that she would meet with a lawyer and figure out how to get him out as soon as possible. Joe did not want their parents to know yet. He told her about the other apartment he had set up for them, and that it might be best to move away from the Russo's place. She agreed. They spent the rest of their visit discussing their plans once Joe was released. Joe assured her that everything would be okay. Maya showed him some pictures she had brought from her visit to Puerto Rico, and they smiled as they looked at them. As the visit ended, they held hands tightly, not wanting to let go. Maya promised Joe she would do everything possible to get him out of there. This young couple was away from home and their families for the first time in their young lives. Newlyweds in a foreign country raising a child. Now faced with this horrible situation, they fought to appear calm and resilient, but the situation weighed heavily on them. It physically hurt to say goodbye and walk away from each other. As she left the prison, Maya felt even more lost and hopeless. She knew they had a long, difficult road ahead, but she was determined to fight for Joe's freedom. Joe felt renewed hope. He thought about Maya and their future together. He also thought about his situation in jail and how he needed to stay alert. He knew he couldn't let his guard down for a moment. He knew what he had was worth fighting for, and had faith that Maya would find the right people and fix everything. So far, it had been the worst experience of his life, but he felt more optimistic about his chances of getting through it. He returned to his cell and sat alone on his mat as usual. After sitting for a while, Ricardo asked Joe who his pretty visitor was. Joe ignored him. Ricardo said louder, Medagon, who was that pretty bitch who came to see you? Ricardo watched Joe's face tense up. He walked over to Joe and stood over him. Tell me where she lives so I can visit her when I get out. She will be so lonely. A few men snickered at their leader's joke. Joe stood up and with rage punched Ricardo as hard as he could in the face. Ricardo took it in stride. Ricardo, who was much bigger and older, began to punch back at Joe, and he was quickly joined by all his paisans, who jumped in on the beating. Heavy blows hit Joe from all sides. Joe fought back with every ounce of strength, but only landed a few punches. He had the will but not the strength to fight them all. Eventually he fell to the ground in a fetal position and used his arms to protect his head. They beat him mercilessly and continued to kick and stomp him, long after all the fight had gone from him. Madigan, don't ever hit an Italian in this jail. You are dog shit, Ricardo sneered. He spat on his lifeless body and walked out of the room. Joe laid there, feeling like he was going to die. He was in excruciating pain and could barely breathe. He tried to call out for help, but his voice was weak and hoarse. The men around him made jokes and laughed at him. Visitors from other cells came to see the broken Americano. He envisioned his mother's face telling him to keep faith. He felt so alone and helpless. After several hours, he carefully got up, trying not to show his incredible agony. He walked slowly and painfully to the shower to clean himself up. He looked in a mirror and saw his face was swollen and unrecognizable. He slowly washed the blood off his face in the sink and then showered to rinse his bruised body. Everything hurt. He went back to his mat and passed out. Hours passed before a guard finally discovered him and called for medical help. He was treated for multiple injuries, including broken ribs, a fractured skull, and internal bleeding. He slipped into a coma and spent the next few days fighting for his life. When he finally recovered, his mind was disoriented and confused. He didn't remember what had happened or where he was. As the memories flooded back, he again felt a sense of despair and hopelessness. He couldn't believe he was still in jail and had no idea when he would be released. He spent the next few weeks recovering from his physical and emotional injuries. He tried to stay positive and hopeful, but it wasn't easy. He felt alone and isolated and missed his family and old life. He spent most of his days lying on his mat, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what he had lost. He knew he had a long road ahead, but was ready to do whatever it took to return to his wife and child. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, Maya wanted to break down and cry, but she knew she had to focus on taking care of Sarah and getting Joe out. Miss Russo watched the baby so she could go to the advocate's office, where she was told she had to make an appointment. Despite her pleas, she was turned away. Her disappointment was overwhelming, and she was told she could not speak to anyone about Joe's case until the following Monday. She began to understand how hard accomplishing anything would be for her, a foreigner with no resources. Next, Maya went to the base and talked to the Navy's Judge Advocate General's office, the JAG office. It provides legal service and advice to military members and their families. They told her they could do nothing to help Joe because he was in an Italian jail. Their American lawyers could not practice law in Italy. He had to rely on his assigned advocate and serve out his Italian sentence. They told her that Joe would be set up with a morale liaison from the base who would check on Joe monthly and ensure he was doing okay while serving his sentence. The liaison would also bring Joe supplies when needed. The JAG informed her that the Navy would likely suspend Joe's military pay while he was in jail. Maya was devastated. She felt even more helpless and alone. She had thought the JAG office would be able to do more to help Joe, but now she realized they were limited in what they could do. She began to understand the gravity of Joe's situation and the challenges they would face in the coming months. Like Joe, Maya's world was closing in. Her optimism began to fade and depression began to set in. Without Joe's pay, she couldn't support herself and the baby. While still on base, she headed to the home of Chief Carter and his wife. She brought them some homemade Puerto Rican dishes. She remembered they had enjoyed them on past visits. She was happy to learn that Chief Carter would be Joe's military liaison and would visit Joe monthly to check on him. The Carters felt bad for Maya and Sarah and about the whole situation. She hoped Chief Carter also believed Joe was innocent and could help to get him out. Returning to her apartment with baby Sarah, she thought about what to do next. She knew she couldn't give up on Joe, but her focus had to shift to finding childcare and a job. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Joe tried to keep himself busy by reading books and doing push-ups. He finally wrote letters to his family and friends back home, telling them about his situation and asking for their help. The news deeply saddened his father, a proud military man himself. He had hoped his son would follow in his footsteps and continue the family's proud military tradition. His father felt anger, not shame. He knew his son was law-abiding and blamed himself for not teaching Joe to stay clear of these situations. His mother was just heartbroken, thinking of her oldest child suffering in prison. They spent many sleepless nights worried about Joe, but neither doubted his innocence. One day Joe received a letter from his mother. She told him they believed in his innocence and would support him however they could. They prayed for him and wanted him to keep faith in God, who would get him through. His mother's letter encouraged him to persevere, and he decided to seek out the prison chaplain, hoping to get guidance. The chaplain listened to Joe's story and offered him comfort. He told Joe that he was not alone and that he had God on his side, and that he should never give up hope. He also suggested that Joe reach out to some of the other inmates to build alliances and find support. Joe thanked the chaplain, but knew, with Ricardo against him, nobody would have his back. He received constant insults and threats from everyone. He took regular unprovoked beatings. Even guys Joe knew he could beat felt empowered to pick fights with him. Fighting back was useless. The entire prison was against him. Altercations were never with just one man. It was always a group effort against him. Ricardo often said to the men, "Qualcuno por favore usare American con uno garrote," meaning somebody please strangle dog shit for me. A jailhouse garrote was made from a cord or wire with handles attached at the ends to strangle enemies. Ricardo constantly instigated the other men, letting them know whoever hurt or killed the American would gain his favor. Meanwhile, Chief Carter began his monthly visits. He was always representing the Navy in an impeccable uniform. Joe could see he was uncomfortable visiting the prison. He told the chief everything and proclaimed his innocence, and he seemed to believe him. The chief became a new lifeline. He knew he was the only one with resources to help get him out. He knew that despite Maya's efforts, a young Puerto Rican girl in Sicily could only do so much. The chief asked what Joe needed regarding toiletries and such. Unlike with Maya, Joe did not make an effort to appear brave. Joe told him the other inmates would steal anything the chief might bring him. He quietly told him how badly he was being treated, and that the other inmates thought he was a rat. He said all the guards were corrupt, and he had no help dealing with the torture from the other inmates. Joe told the chief somebody would probably kill him, and he did not know how long he would last. He told the chief everything, hoping the chief could help get him moved to a safer place. Chief Carter appeared sincerely sorry for Joe. He promised to do whatever he could to help, and that he would get word back to the Navy about Joe's treatment. Joe felt a lot better after the visit. Knowing Maya and Chief Carter were both working on his behalf comforted him. Joe assumed his advocate would eventually be coming to address his living conditions. The fact was, Chief Parker was furious with Joe, and embarrassed that his star troop had been caught dealing drugs to other sailors. He had taken Joe under his wing and bragged about him to his peers, and the kid had made a damn fool of him. To add insult to his injury, he believed his superiors had chosen him to be Joe's morale officer to mock him. He had felt Joe had made him into a laughingstock. He didn't care if Joe was guilty or not. In his eyes, Joe should have never been hanging out with drug dealers in the first place. The chief had been doubly insulted to hear Joe begging him for help when Joe had known he despised anything to do with drugs. The chief had figured the best lesson for Joe was to let him rot in jail. He had decided not to lift a finger to help him. After the visit, as the chief walked out of the jail, a guard said, "Don't worry, sir, we will take care of your soldier." The guard was surprised to hear the chief respond with, "I don't care what happens to him in here." The chief's parting words eventually found their way back to Ricardo, who now knew no one was coming to help Joe. When Chief Carter returned to the JAG office to report on how Joe was doing, he told them that Joe was doing fine and he didn't need a thing. "He's living like a king," he said. "He likes it better than the Navy." Unfortunately for Joe, the beatings and torture worsened, and Ricardo ensured he barely got enough food to survive. After a few weeks of this, he became unkempt and frail. He was afraid because he knew that becoming weak in prison was a death sentence, and made him easy prey. Any will to fight or even argue diminished. His mind grew delirious and wandered. Ultimately, his nightmare grew more horrific when his vulnerability was discovered by the sexual predators who came for him at night. There was nothing he could do to stop them. Joe disassociated from reality by forcing his mind to drift away to thoughts of his home and family during the horrible abuses. He spent his days contemplating the reasons for living. He prayed for death to come and end his misery. His love for his family and his religious beliefs did not allow suicide, but he began to hope his abusers might kill him to ease his suffering. In many prisons, the expression "the inmates are running the asylum" is true. The inmates police themselves. The guards are severely outnumbered and cannot control everything. So prisoners have their own leaders and rules that all inmates must abide by. The leaders enforce the rules. This arrangement works best for keeping the peace. The guards were no help to Joe. Their work was to provide a facade of control to outsiders and to sneak in whatever contraband was needed. Keeping chaos to a minimum prevails at the expense of the safety of victims like Joe. Maya felt like they needed to make more progress. Joe's situation in prison was getting worse, and she couldn't bear the thought of him spending the next year in that hellhole. During visits, she noticed a change in him. He seemed even more frail and tired. and wasn't talkative. She asked if he was okay, and he responded with weak smiles and short answers. Maya could see the pain in her husband's eyes and the bruises on his face and body. She knew she was losing him. He knew she was doing everything she could to help him, which comforted him, but it wasn't enough. And their visits were never long enough, and they always left feeling alone again. Joe never burdened Maya with the accounts of his treatment inside. He did not want to add anything more to the load she was already carrying because of the situation he had caused their family. It took nearly all his strength to try and appear hopeful, strong, and brave for her. The truth was, he was not sure how long he could survive. They filled their hour for visitation with cute stories about Sarah's development and memories of Puerto Rico. Maya vowed at every visit to keep working on getting him out, and they professed their love to each other and prayed for a miracle to bring them back together soon. Maya found a less expensive place to live and childcare so she could work. During multiple visits to the advocate's office, they deceived her with false updates regarding his appeal. They always assured her progress was being made toward an early release. As months went by, she realized they were misleading her. It hurt her beyond words to helplessly watch Joe deteriorating mentally and physically. The hopelessness they saw in each other's eyes grew impossible to hide. Joe continued to believe Carter was on his side. He didn't understand why no help came from the military. The chief visited monthly, but never had good news. He told Joe his superiors knew his situation and were working to help him. Joe had nothing to hide. His life depended on Chief's help. He pleaded with the chief. Chief Carter, they're fucking me in the ass. They're going to kill me. Please tell my wife to go back to Puerto Rico because I will not make it in here. Hearing the awful details of regular torture and rape did nothing to change the chief's sense of betrayal. He continued to make promises about the help that would never come. He continued to report back to the base that Joe was doing great. More time went by, and Joe continued to suffer in jail. He continued to plead his innocence to anyone who would listen. He accepted that no help was coming for him. Chief Carter couldn't conceal his contempt, and Joe finally realized the chief had been lying to him. He gave up on the idea of any aid coming from anywhere. His life was in God's hands. He stopped pleading with the chief during their visits. Their discussions lost any semblance of friendliness. Joe asked for stationery to write to Maya and left it at that. Eventually, Chief Carter stopped coming at all, but he reported as if the visits continued and all was well. No one knew if the Navy would have or could have helped Joe because they never knew about his condition. Joe's treatment in jail continued to worsen. His health deteriorated, and he became more unwell with each passing day. He had lost hope and the will to live, and felt utterly alone in his suffering. His visits with Maya did provide temporary comfort, but it hurt him worse than the torture to have her see him this way. He wished he could protect her from worrying. He knew it was breaking her. He tried to persuade her to return home with their daughter so she could have help and provide a healthier environment for Sarah. At 6 months, Maya ran out of all resources and accepted that she needed the support of her family and had to return to Puerto Rico. It slightly raised Joe's spirits to know his wife and child were going home and would be cared for by their loved ones. He was now relieved of the constant anxiety from wondering how they were doing on their own in Sicily. He was reassured they would be safe. It gave him new energy to focus on surviving in his living hell. He spent his days in his cell, on his mat, praying and writing letters to his wife, hoping against hope that he would see her and Sarah again. He felt forgotten and abandoned by those he had trusted to protect him. He endured unimaginable suffering and torment at the hands of his fellow inmates. He never lost faith in God and continued to pray for a miracle that would bring him home to his family. After 8 months, Renzo, the only reason Joe was there, was granted release. For the last 8 months, Renzo had kept his distance in the face of Joe's suffering. Before he left, his conscience overtook him, and Renzo finally attempted to show Joe some compassion by speaking with him. The attempt included a half-assed apology that still blamed Joe for their incarceration. Joe didn't have the strength for anger anymore. He had grown physically numb to his torture, and found the most relief when his mind was empty of thoughts. He ignored Renzo's half-hearted attempt and stared blankly as his one-time friend said goodbye and was let out of prison. In his 9th month of incarceration, Joe heard Ricardo, the cell boss, was getting out. Joe internalized his joy as he watched his biggest tormentor pack his things. With Ricardo's release, Joe's treatment drastically improved. The new cell boss was indifferent to him. The guards and inmates who had felt sympathy for him could now befriend him. He could now take the chaplain's advice and started to reach out to some of the other inmates. He found a few friendly ears, and together they formed a small group, watching each other's backs and offering each other support. Over time, Joe started to feel less isolated and more empowered. The attacks began to lessen. He moved his belongings to an empty bunk bed in the room and could now eat all of his food rations. These small changes in his life made a huge difference. and he finally saw a light flicker on at the end of the dark tunnel he was in. In a short time, his mind grew healthier. Now that Maya had gone, he no longer had visitors, but he received letters from her saying she and Sarah were doing well back at home, how everyone enjoyed watching Sarah grow up, and how much their families missed him. He was finally able to reply to her honestly with news of his improving condition. She told him that everyone in their families knew the truth about what happened and were sure of his innocence. Everyone was waiting for his return to Puerto Rico. He imagined that if he ever made it out of there, he and his family could put the entire experience behind them and start fresh. As for Maya, she never gave up on her husband. She continued to fight for his release, even though it seemed hopeless. She reached out to advocacy groups and anyone who might be able to help, but no one was listening. They kept their love alive through letters, even though the distance between them was unbearable. Months 10 and 11 were better. The sexual abuse stopped, and the bullying was minimal. His worst tormentors had either gotten released or had moved on to torturing newer inmates. He was left alone for the most part and had made some friends. He began to feel like a human again. He had long accepted that his career in the military was over, but hope for surviving and seeing his family again had returned fully to his mind. As he neared his 1-year mark in prison, Joe began to feel like he could survive this ordeal. He realized that he wasn't alone, had people who cared about him, and had the strength to endure even the most challenging circumstances. Back on base, Chief Carter received orders for his final duty station in Florida. He felt no guilt about Joe and could care less about what became of him. After several drinks at his send-off party, he brought up Joe to the other chiefs. The men gathered around the dark bar and laughed as he drunkenly imitated Joe begging for his help. Chief Carter, they're fucking me in the ass, they're fucking me in the ass. Tell my wife to go back to Puerto Rico. He laughed as he took a drink. I stopped visiting that fucking drug dealer months ago, and I don't give a shit if he's guilty or not, he boasted. The story's gravity caused the mood in the bar to grow somber, and the laughter subsided. Chief Carter continued drinking, but the rest of the men decided to call it a night. Chief Randy Harbor, who was at the bar, was highly disturbed by what he heard. He remembered hearing about the sailors arrested after the festival, but didn't know there was still one in prison. Chief Harbor hoped Carter was exaggerating about the young sailor's treatment. The next day he went to the JAG office to inquire about Joe. They told him all reports they had received were positive. According to their records, Joe was doing fine and was about a year in on a 16-month sentence. Chief Harbor told them he knew Chief Carter had outbound orders and volunteered to take over as liaison. He asked to read Joe's file. The JAG officer placed the file on a table for him to review. He told the chief to report back after he visited with Joe, and Harbor agreed. The JAG officer excused himself to take a phone call in another room. When Harbor saw the officer was distracted, he tucked the file under his arm and slipped out the door. Several days later, Joe was called to the warden's office. He was told that he had a visitor. Joe's heart raced as he was led to the visitor's area. He had not had a visitor in several months. He saw a man in a uniform sitting at a table. The man introduced himself as his new liaison. Joe assumed he was there to deliver the bad news about his future Navy punishment. He sat down, and Chief Harbor explained that Carter was heading back stateside and that he was taking over. He told Joe he was there to help him. He sat with a pen and a pad before him for note-taking and asked Joe to tell his whole story from the beginning, and Joe reluctantly recounted his entire experience. He finished by saying, even though I was innocent, I couldn't shake the feeling of shame and guilt, knowing I let myself, my family, and the Navy down. Chief Harbor told Joe that he believed his whole story and apologized for what happened to him. We should have taken better care of you, he said, adding again that he would do all he could to help, and that he would file a complaint with the prison authorities. Joe returned to his bunk and tried to figure out what to make of the new liaison. He had very little faith in promises made to him. He decided it was best not to get his hopes up and returned to his daily routine. After the visit, Chief Harbor returned to the JAG office and relayed Joe's story. The JAG officers listened but appeared to have doubts about the new report. Harbor raised his voice and authoritatively said, "Listen, sir, the sailor has been raped and tortured. You need to intervene immediately." The officer quickly agreed to investigate the new report. First, he called the Italian Advocate's office to let them know they were looking into the living conditions and treatment of incarcerated American servicemen. The advocate recognized that they were referring to Joe. He called to inform his colleagues at the jail and recommended they do a health check. The Navy's new interest took everyone by surprise. Out of concern for a potential probe, they moved Joe to a cell near the processing area at the front of the jail. The next day, his advocate, whom he had not seen since their first meeting in court, visited him with news of a possible early release. Joe dropped his head on the table and wept. He asked how Joe had been doing and got wide-eyed and shaken by the details he heard. He avoided eye contact and uncomfortably scanned the room as if looking for an escape. At an apparent loss for words, he said, "It has been great to see you. More news will be forthcoming." And he abruptly excused himself and walked out. Meanwhile, the Navy JAG office pressured prison authorities for Joe's release, and the officials, wanting to avoid publicity and scrutiny, quickly complied. After a full year, his advocate met with the judge to work out the details of his release. He came and told Joe that once released, the Navy could charge him as well, and if that happened, he would have to serve additional time in a military prison. With that, the advocate left the room, and Joe never saw him again. Joe couldn't wait to leave the Sicilian prison, but the thought of being kept from his family in another jail crushed him. The only thing he prayed for now was to be reunited with Maya and Sarah. That night, Joe wrote to Maya to share the bittersweet news. The next day, Joe was mystified when, for the first time in a year, he was asked by a guard if he needed anything. He asked for the only thing he really wanted, to talk to Maya. After some time passed, a guard returned with news that permission to make a long-distance call was granted. It became evident to Joe that Chief Harbor was directly responsible for the new treatment he was receiving. Joe had his phone call with Maya, whose voice he had last heard almost 6 months ago. It was a joyous moment for them both. He told her he should be leaving the Sicilian prison soon, and that they were one step closer to being reunited. It was the news she had been hoping for, and Maya felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She could finally breathe again. They cried out their love and yearning for each other. She was delighted to hear about the new cell and new liaison. They both prayed to thank God for the blessings and to help get Joe home. On base, Chief Harbor requested to meet with the base commander to discuss Joe's case. Harbor relayed the whole story in the meeting, including Chief Carter's drunken confession. "God damn, this kid's been through the ringer, hasn't he?" said the commander. He asked the chief if he believed Joe. "I do," Harbor replied. Harbor explained, even if Joe was guilty of selling marijuana, his jail treatment was unjustified. Joe had his family taken from him, he lost his career, he was raped and tortured for months in that jail. The punishment did not meet the crime, sir. "So why are you telling me this, Chief?" the commander replied. "I want to help this kid out, sir," Harbor answered. "Make sure he receives fair treatment from now on. And I want to ensure that what happened to him doesn't happen to anyone else. Our guys can't get treated like this. The kid is scheduled to get out soon, after a year inside. He has to come back here to face whatever punishment the Navy decides on before being dishonorably discharged. I think he's suffered enough. I know his Navy career is over. I'm asking you to forgo further punishment and let him go home on a general discharge. He goes home and we never hear from him again." "Shit, Randy. That's asking a lot. This kid's crime is documented. Do you want me to ignore his file showing a record of serving time in a foreign prison?" "With all due respect, sir," the chief replied, "I have his entire record. I borrowed it from the JAG's office when I took over as liaison." The commander's eyebrows raised. The chief continued, "I'll explain how it will work to the kid. If anything goes wrong, I'll fall on the sword and take responsibility for faking his paperwork and misleading everyone." "That's a lot of responsibility you're accepting," the commander said. "Look, sir, I heard this kid was a damn good sailor. A lifer. He got shafted, and I feel like this is the least we can do after what he's been through." The commander nodded thoughtfully. "I understand, Chief. Let's see what we can do. I'll reach out to my contacts in the Sicilian government and see what I can find out. Now get the hell out of here before I lose plausible deniability." Chief Harbor returned to visit Joe and told him he had made some inquiries and had some good news. He said, shrugging his shoulders with eyebrows raised, "Somehow, the JAG office misplaced your file. They have no record of your arrest or jail term. The Navy's fuck-up with your file is going to help you considerably," he explained. "It's as if you had been working in your shop the whole time. Upon your release from prison, I will pick you up. You will travel back to the base for your immediate out-processing on a general discharge, then take you to the airport so you can travel back home to Puerto Rico. I want to make this clear. There will be no record of your incarceration. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Joe's eyes welled up with tears. He knew Chief Harbor was responsible for answering his prayers. He stared at his rescuer speechless as the tears ran down his face. Harbor said, "Keep your head down for a few days. Don't make any trouble. We want this to go as smoothly as possible." Joe was overwhelmed with gratitude and emotion. He thanked Chief Harbor. He couldn't believe that he would finally be going home to Maya and his family after all this time. The day finally arrived and Chief Harbor picked Joe up from prison. With his eyes closed, he inhaled the fresh, clean outside air deeply, and exhaled it slowly in an attempt to cleanse himself of the jail's wretched contaminants. He had gotten so close to death that he now understood what his life and new beginning were worth. He resolved to never take his freedom for granted again. They drove back to the base. It went just like the chief said. The Navy dropped all charges against him, and somehow his discharge papers were upgraded to honorable. Chief Harbor drove him to the airport, and at the gate he said, "Petty Officer Rivera, thank you for your service to the United States Navy. Good luck to you in all your future endeavors." He reached out to shake Joe's hand. Joe stepped forward and hugged him tightly. Chief Harbor raised his hands to return the embrace. With both men on the verge of tears, the chief said, "Get on that plane and return to your family." Joe replied, "Yes, sir," as he turned and disappeared down the jetway. In 1971, Joe landed in San Juan, where Maya waited for him. They ran towards each other and embraced, tears streaming down their faces. They kissed passionately, and Joe finally felt at home. They had gone through hell and back, but they were now stronger and more in love than ever. They knew their journey was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever challenges came their way together. So here's the where are they now part of the story. Joe used his GI Bill to earn a college degree and started a successful electrical contracting business in San Juan, Puerto Rico. He and Maya raised 3 children together and are still in love and happily married. Since 1979, Joe has been instrumental in the Puerto Rican government's prison reform initiatives. Joe found a new sense of purpose in helping other former inmates readjust to life outside of prison. He became a counselor and advocate for prisoners' rights, using his experience to help others navigate the challenges of reentry into society. He is still proud of his military service. In their 70s now, he and Maya are retired and still in love. Chief Carter left Sicily and finished out his Navy career in Florida. He then retired back to Arkansas. He never felt guilt about not reporting back about Joe, and he never knew or cared if Joe survived his incarceration. After the Navy's investigation, the Italian advocate was fired and never represented a U.S. service member again. The story of Joe's wrongful imprisonment is tragic, highlighting the importance of due process and the need for reform in global justice systems. It also serves as a reminder that even in the darkest times, faith, hope, and love can sustain us and help us endure even the most unimaginable suffering. The end.